Welcome to this online lecture for History 314. Today we are going to talk about World War I and what it was like for the soldiers who had to live in the trenches. Now, the typical beginning of World War I is dated to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. That assassination occurred on June 28, 1914. Just over a month later, by August 4th, all of Europe's great powers were at war. This is how the two sides broke down. The Allies consisted of Great Britain, France, and Russia, whereas the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, or what today we call Turkey. Before the war was over, however, the war had grown much larger and involved far more countries. This shows you exactly who was on what side. Now the little asterisks on the left side, you see one by Italy. Now remember, Italy had been an ally of Germany before the war, but it switched sides in the middle of the war. Also, there are two asterisks next to Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and that's because these were possessions or colonies of Great Britain. They really had no choice but to join their mother country in World War I. Now there was a belief that the war would end quickly. There was reason to believe that this was probably true. Since 1815, European wars had been short, most lasting less than a year. In fact, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany said, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." He was wrong. World War I, which lasts 4 years, will cost 20 million dead and 21 million wounded. Moreover, for the men who survived, the war was a nightmare, as depicted in this painting by the German artist Otto Dix. Dix served in the German army and experienced the war firsthand. Here is a little better look at that same painting. Study it and just see what kind of an impression or what kind of an image of World War I was left on Otto Dix. In August of 1914, the horrors of World War I still remained in the future. In the early days of the war, everything went according to Germany's plan. According to that plan, Germany would first focus on defeating France. The German army would launch a massive attack on the Western Front, invading France through Belgium and Luxembourg. At the same time, a smaller force would hold off the Russians in the east. There was one problem with this plan, however. Belgium was a neutral nation, and Great Britain promised to uphold that neutrality. Should Germany invade, it just might bring the British into the war. Now, initially, Germany's plan worked brilliantly. The German army swept through Belgium in less than 3 weeks. Now, predictably, the British declared war, but it didn't seem to matter. The German army continued to advance into northern France, coming within a few miles of Paris. Meanwhile, in the east, the Germans experienced unexpected success. The plan had been to merely hold the line against the Russians. Instead, the German army smashed the Russians and immediately drove them back. It looked as though the Kaiser was going to be right. The war might just be over in 6 weeks. But then in early September, the British and the French stopped the German advance at the First Battle of the Marne. At this point, the war in the West will bog down into a defensive struggle with both sides protected behind long lines of trenches dug into the ground. It was nearly impossible to dislodge troops protected by trenches. This diagram shows how the trenches were dug. There wasn't one line, but 3. The front line, or firing line, was where most of the fighting occurred. Behind the front line, however, was a support line of trenches. In case of a major attack, soldiers in the support line could be brought up to reinforce the soldiers on the front line. Farther back still were the reserve lines. Again, in the case of a major attack, soldiers in this line could be brought up in support of the front line. Soldiers could move from one line to another without exposing their heads to enemy fire, by means of a communication trench that were dug vertically between the lines. This is an aerial shot of the trenches. You can see how detailed and intricate they were. So what was it like for the men serving in the trenches? Well, from the perspective of Otto Dix, it was a nightmare. But why? Well, first of all, there was the smell. As the war progressed, soldiers had to deal with the rotting corpses of their comrades. The corpses might sit for days at a time or be buried in shallow graves. Moreover, it didn't take long for the trenches to fill with water and mud. This added to the smell and to the misery of the men. And then there were the rats and the lice. Rats were an especial problem, because they ran over the men while they tried to sleep at night. They also nibbled on the corpses and ate the food of the living. In short, they tormented and terrified the men almost as much as the enemy did. The men took to hunting the rats with their rifles or their bayonets. Still, it was fruitless. The trenches were filled with hundreds of rats, because rats can produce up to 75 offspring each year. That meant, really, no matter how many they killed, there was no way they were going to take care of all of them. The rats just kept coming back. The men also had to live with almost constant noise as the enemy would launch shell after shell into the opposing trenches. Finally, there was the boredom. It might seem strange that the men would complain of having nothing to do. However, attacks in World War I were rare. Instead, most of a man's service in the trenches was spent standing around waiting for something to happen. Moreover, there were few diversions, I should say. You couldn't raise your head above the trench without fear of being shot by a sniper. Thus you were stuck looking at the sky. One survivor said that many of the men took a great interest in birds, because birds in flight were the only things they could see. Because life in the trenches was so difficult, the various armies were very good about rotating men in and out of the front lines. In the British Army, for example, the men would spend 8 days on the front line, or the firing line. Then they would rotate back to the support trench for 4 days, and then back to the reserve trench for another 4 days. Then they would be taken out of the trenches completely, before beginning the cycle all over again. Of course, that was the plan, or how it was supposed to work. If the enemy attacked, a unit might be expected to spend far longer on the front lines. Some spent 3 to 4 weeks straight in the front line trench. Trenches, along with machine guns and other modern weapons, ensured that the defensive position on the front line had all of the advantages. Unfortunately, you can't win a war by just playing defense, however. You need to attack. You need to advance and dislodge the enemy. The leadership in World War I on both sides believed that the only way to break through trenches was with massive assaults. First, there would be an artillery bombardment to soften up the enemy. This might go on for days as thousands of explosive shells were dropped on the enemy lines. Typically, these attacks were ordered for early mornings. The next step was to go over the top. Now, typically, these attacks were ordered for early in the morning, when there was still a cover of darkness. Soldiers who went over the top climbed out of their trench and walked across no man's land to try and reach enemy lines and use their rifles or bayonets to kill the enemy. Things rarely went so smoothly, however. Attacking troops had to first cross no man's land, as I just said. This is the region between the two lines, and it could be anywhere from a few kilometers or miles across to several hundred yards. So it was not an easy thing to cross. No man's land was a hellscape pockmarked with bomb craters. Nor was there any cover. Every tree and rock had been eliminated by the fighting and by the bombardment. And then there was the barbed wire, which caught on clothing and skin. And once you were caught, you were a sitting duck. You were a sitting duck especially for the machine guns. A machine gun could fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. Now, actually, they were rarely this effective. That's because they easily overheated, and so they could only be fired in quick bursts. The problem was solved by providing water cooling units to the guns, and later vents would be placed in the guns that cooled them off using air. The effect was that a machine gun basically could fire as many rounds as 80 men with rifles. That meant that only a few men could hold off a dozen attackers. Nevertheless, the odds against success did not deter generals on both sides from ordering attacks on the enemy. From February through July 1916, the Germans tried to dislodge French forces from the fortresses surrounding the city of Verdun. They failed at the cost of 600 to 700,000 total casualties on both sides. Remember, a total of just more than 600,000 soldiers were lost in the entire U.S. Civil War, the bloodiest war in U.S. history. Therefore, the losses at Verdun were staggering. Another bloody battle in the war was the Battle of the Somme, which was fought between July and November 1916. This was an attack by the British against German forces, and it had no more success than the German attack at Verdun, even though casualty counts were even higher. Look at that. It's almost 1 million men were either killed or wounded in the Battle of the Somme. That is absolutely insane. The need for a decisive victory and the problems that they had dislodging the enemy from trenches led both sides to try some horrible new weapons. The worst may have been poison gas. The Germans were the first to employ poison gas in the front lines. Chlorine gas was used first at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium in 1915. Now, chlorine was an effective gas because it burned the throat, much the way smoke does during a fire. Basically, those who were hit with chlorine would suffocate. Another poison gas used in World War I was mustard gas. Mustard gas worked more slowly than chlorine. Prolonged exposure could burn the skin and could cause blindness. It also could destroy the lungs, making it impossible to breathe. Both sides used poison gas during the war, but it failed to turn the tide. A greater impact might have been psychological. Poison gas attacks absolutely terrified the troops. Other new weapons, in addition to poison gas, that were introduced to try and break the stalemate of the trench included tanks, as well as airplanes. Neither of these weapons, however, proved advanced enough to turn the tide of battle in World War I. That would have to wait until the next time Europe went to war in 1939. Thus, I hope you have some understanding of the suffering that soldiers serving in the trenches of World War I went through. It was absolutely hell for the most part. And so anyway, we're going to continue to look at this in some other ways. So, thank you for listening.